And welcome to Inside Olympia. Multiple states this year are considering legalizing psilocybin, a psychedelic associated with magic mushrooms. Advocates say it has magical properties to address any number of disorders, from severe depression to addiction. In our second half, we'll talk with the prime sponsor of a measure to legalize the use of psilocybin in Washington. But first, it's been a decade since Washington voters approved the recreational sale of cannabis to adults. So what lessons have been learned since then, what's working and what's not working? Joining me now to talk about this and much more is State Representative Shelley Kloba, the Democratic co-chair of the newly renamed House Committee on Regulated Substances and Gaming, and State Representative Kelly Chambers, the ranking Republican on that committee. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
So let's talk about the renaming of this committee. It's not really a new committee, but just a newly named committee.
Correct. The name used to be Commerce and Gaming, and this just clarifies a little bit that the very specific things that are in our portfolio related to commerce are alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, and gaming. Okay. So,
what on these? I'm always kind of interested just to get a temperature check or a pulse check on how much on a particular committee, how much the issues tend to be bipartisan versus, oh, this is a committee that really shows the partisan divide. What would you say as the ranking member on this committee? How do these issues sort of tend to cleave from a partisan standpoint?
Well, there's a lot of individuals on the committee, so people are putting their ideas forward. There's it's an area where everybody kind of has their lane, and people stay in it. Everybody, in terms of like the stakeholder groups that want to protect what they have or have something that someone else doesn't have. I think the former state representative Steve Kirby described the committee well. This is I want what that guy has, but them to not have what I have committee. Okay. So it's a lot of that, and with the renaming, I just want for the record that I was not consulted in this piece. I say we call it fun and games, but it is definitely an interesting policy area to work in with all the issues that we do oversee.
Yeah, a lot happening in this space.
It is, and I think we, rather than partisan lines, a lot of times it's more philosophical. So there may be some pro-business ideas. There may be some attitudes that come into play from the treatment and prevention community, and that's certainly a line sometimes that we cleave down, and so it's always going to be a mystery. I've given up on predicting which bills are going to go which ways, because it's always interesting.
Well, before we talk, and I do want to spend a lot of time talking about cannabis legalization, where we are a decade later, but let's get a couple of other issues out of the way, and we'll start. The Super Bowl is right around the corner here, so sports gaming just started in Massachusetts. It's sort of a big thing in a lot of states. What's its status in Washington? I know you're limited in what you can say because there's some litigation around this, but a bill has been introduced?
Yes, that's correct.
Is 2023 the year we're going to see serious action on sports gaming, or should we...
I think my colleague might have some information about that.
Well, was it 2 years ago that we legalized sports betting in Washington? And at that time, there was a tribal and a bill introduced, and one that included the card rooms. That other one was not given a hearing that year, so it was introduced again this year. I don't think that we're going to see a lot of action on it this year, and so tribal or gaming, sports betting at the tribal casinos is where it remains.
Is allowed in Washington, but right. It's limited to that. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
On alcohol, one of the trends that I'm noticing that's happening is there's a lot of new drinks showing up on the market, and they're coming from the soft drink makers, companies that have not traditionally been in the alcohol sales business. Virginia is now looking at passing legislation to require that those products like Mountain Dew and Hard Mountain Dew not show up on the same shelf together, for instance, because that's happening in some states. Is your committee hearing yet about this kind of these crossover drinks, this new entree into the alcohol business, this foray?
Well, the conversation that Virginia is having is not one that we've anticipated here.
And I don't think any of those products, and I may be wrong about this, have been approved here yet either, which may be part of the issue that the conversation hasn't been prompted.
I think there's the type of things like, hard cider, yeah. And I don't want to name any brand names, but like a hard lemonade or not your father's root beer. Right. So I think they're getting into that. However, we haven't
come
had
to your
the very
committee.
specific ones with those big brands.
But we do have the low-proof spirits bill, and that one has been around for a couple of years, but we did have a hearing on it this year. And that's where one of the debates is how those beverages are taxed in Washington, and the fight between malt-based, beer-based drinks and spirits-based drinks. The way the tax structure is makes it difficult for any of those spirits-based drinks to compete with the beer-based
because the tax is higher than on the malt.
Significantly higher. And you don't see that when you pick that up at the grocery store and put it in your cart until that tax is applied at the register. And so I think it was one of the big grocery stores, Fred Meyer's may have testified that this is their number one go-back item. When people see the final price, they put that item back. And so for me, you know, I'm looking at the small businesses, the distilleries that we've enabled to operate here in Washington, and we've made investments in those. Just 2 miles down the road, there's the South Puget Sound Community College has their brewing and distilling program, which the legislature has invested more than $10 million in building that beautiful state-of-the-art facility. And, you know, those, we're losing distillery licenses every year. It's tough to compete, and if they can't compete with the, you know, similar perceived products on the market, how are they going to survive? So, you know, I'm a small business owner, and I want to see those. I want Washington to have the next, you know, Jack Daniel's brand. That would be terrific, and I think with proper legislation in place, we can make that happen.
What does the chair think of changing the tax rate?
I think it's been interesting to really have this conversation about the fundamental kind of unfairness about having, you know, the nature of these beverages is they might be, you know, 10% spirits and 90% other things, carbonated water or fruit juice or what have you. And the entire beverage gets taxed at the spirits rate. I mean, that kind of defies logic. And so I think there's support for that portion. But the bill also gets rid of the taxes that are in place before it hits the shelf and the consumer. It's built into that price that the consumer sees. And the bill would also get rid of all of that. And so I think that it is, you know, gathering some momentum that it might be time to look in a holistic way at the taxes that we have on the alcohol industry and see if there's, you know, a different approach that we can take that might have some more parity. It might involve spirit prices, taxes coming down, beer and wine coming up to have some sort of level of revenue neutrality. But I think it is worth that conversation, and so I'm encouraged by that.
Would either of you at this point predict in this session resolution around this, or is this a multi-year conversation?
It's already been going on for multiple years, so everybody's kind of made their points known in terms of those,
Everybody knows where everybody stands.
Everybody knows where their lane is,
Yeah.
And so it's just a matter of, are we going to act? I mean, we haven't had a lot of really substantive policy change come out of this committee this year, and so could we? Yes. Is there time? Sure.
But I think, is there the consensus? And that's
And
where
you're not sensing that yet?
Yeah, I don't see folks coalescing around one single idea.
What about sticking with alcohol for a minute? During the pandemic, we experimented with some things, including the cocktails to go. You could, you know, get your food to go, and then you could get a cocktail. What's the thinking on liberalizing maybe our laws a little bit, allowing that kind of thing to continue even in a post-pandemic environment?
Well, that bill originally was my bill that allowed that during COVID, because we really did want to follow the lead that the LCB had set in trying to give some leeway so that businesses could stay in business. And so a lot of those things made sense that they did. We changed the amount of the cost of certain licenses. We did a variety of things, and this was one. We said, okay, well, we understand the predicament that you're in, so we're going to, for, you know, a certain given period of time, we're going to allow this, and we'll see how it goes. You know, it was purposefully put a sunset in there. The prevention community still has a great deal of concern about it, and it's not undeserved. The compliance checks that the LCB does when they do them both at retail stores where they send in someone who's undercover and underage to see if they can be successful in buying liquor. The compliance checks, they only passed 55% of the time in the ones that they were able to do. And it is a little harder to do a compliance check when it's not a retail location, it's somebody's home or what have you. So those, the concerns I think that the prevention community had about not knowing who's actually getting the delivery, that did come to fruition. So I know that the bill sponsor is trying to really do a lot of work to come up with something that can move forward. So we'll see.
But, we're having this conversation in the context also of record number of highway deaths last year in this state and nationally, at least in recent times, and also a proposal in the Transportation Committee in the Senate side to reduce the BAC level. So as you all are thinking about the rules and regulations and laws around alcohol in this state, and then you overlay those growing concerns about alcohol-related deaths, how is that informing the thinking?
I think we are given a lot of statistics that are really high level and not being able to dig very deep into what's behind that. So I had seen recently a city that's partly in my district lowering speed limits. And I want to dig deeper. Were any of the fatalities that we had in the previous year in any of those areas? And surprisingly, not one was. So that just gives me more questions than I have answers to right now, but I want to see a lot more behind the data. And I think just one of the themes that we see going on is, with the emergency declaration during COVID is, those temporary allowances that were given is which ones of those can we, make permanent that can still be a win-win that has that safety and regulation and accountability piece, but also allows that innovation and helping out the small businesses that we were able to keep in business with those rule changes.
So at this point, in terms of ready to go cocktails, where would you land at this point? Yes or no votes?
Well, I've been, working with some of the stakeholders on it and kind of clarifying some of those pieces. The compliance wasn't where we would want it to be in order to make this permanent. But then we've seen the industry react and those delivery services make changes, creating mandatory training for their delivery drivers, not allowing anybody to deliver anymore if they had violations. And we haven't gotten compliance check data since, through those delivery services that then made that training mandatory. The other kind of question that we're kind of wrestling with is, what should the training be? Should a delivery driver have the same sort of training as a bartender, a server? If they're not, pouring and making cocktails, it's a little bit different interaction that they have with the end user, receiver of the product than you would in a restaurant setting. So some of the industries have come up with their own training and want to be able to do that, and I think pushed and held accountable that they're being innovative and the technology that they use to make that happen.
And I do applaud the sponsor of that bill for really sitting down and doing the work, and I think the companies are trying to be flexible. I think there's still some unresolved issues as to, does it make more sense to have one official training or let the companies devise their own, which, who knows what the quality of that is. Do you require, company X is going to allow their drivers to do this? Not every single driver would want to participate, and so do you make everyone take that training, or only the ones who are doing the deliveries? And the cost of the compliance checks is, like I had mentioned, a little bit more expensive and complicated to do. We heard criticism that maybe it wasn't a large enough sample size, and that 55% maybe is an unrealistic thing to pin a whole policy on. And so, the worries that people have are still there, but I think there's some progress being made.
Okay, so we've talked about gaming, we've talked about alcohol, or we could talk about on both those, but we'll move on. I want to just ask briefly about tobacco and also alternate non-tobacco-based nicotine products, vaping, smokeless tobacco. Are these issues before your committee this year? Is that sort of a trending thing, or not so much right now?
So we have one bill this year that deals with tobacco, and I think vaping as well. I think because the bill's emphasis is on underage access, and the vaping seems to be more popular than the classic cigarettes. But at the root of all of it is the highly addictive nicotine and the effect on the younger, still developing brain. And so I think it was a thoughtful approach to try and go after the folks who are selling these products, the retailers, as opposed to doing a traffic stop and going after the youth who actually are in possession. There's, I think, a great important role for education. And I think we've seen some of those education campaigns that are in the media that seem to be impactful, whether or not they are effective at curbing teen use. I haven't seen the statistics on that.
Well, this is a huge concern. A lot of kids are vaping.
Yes.
And they're not supposed to be. It's bad for their health.
Right.
So is there something more the state can do? Because the parents are worried about this. Many kids is happening behind their back. And then we hear about kids who, if they're not picking up their phone first thing in the morning, they're picking up their vape pen first thing in the morning.
Yeah, rightly so. Parents should be concerned, and that's where I stand behind parents who want to know what's going on with their kids and having that access to them. The bill before the committee, I don't think it's where it needs to be to vote it out, and the sponsor has told me so. That, if I don't know if there was a word in there that maybe frightened some folks, but to detain a kid, if somebody in law enforcement sees a kid coming out of a store and vaping, can they question them? Well, if you're going to levy greater fines on the seller of the product, but an officer can't talk to a kid to get their age and determine the facts of the case, how do you then proceed with fining the retailer? That's problematic. So I don't think that one's ready to go. But I do just agree with you that youth access is a problem. And some good news there. I wish all parents would see the Healthy Youth Survey that shows cannabis use coming down less frequently with high school students. That's a good sign. But as a former teacher, I think it should be in our curriculum that these topics, vaping and high potency THC are something that kids should be learning about, and probably not in high school, probably before that, because the younger and younger ages having access to it is alarming in my book.
Well, it's a good transition to talk about cannabis. We are just past the 10-year anniversary since the vote to legalize recreational cannabis, and I imagine this could be your full-time job, just trying to navigate, regulate, and update this regulated marketplace for the next decade. Let me start though, just Representative Kloba, in terms of how you think it's going overall, because there are a lot of criticisms we're hearing.
Mm-hmm. I think those criticisms are something that you should probably expect when you're on the bleeding edge of a new thing. And, we were right after Colorado on legalizing it, and it came out of an initiative which sometimes can be problematic in terms of creating legislation, because it's oftentimes geared around that which we think will pass and not what is the best system that anybody on the planet could create. And there were a lot of things we didn't know. I think one of the things that we are finding, and other states have done differently after us, was in terms of social equity. And I think there was maybe a little bit of naivete about, if we just make it not illegal anymore, then this disproportionate arrest rate that we're seeing among communities of color for possession of cannabis, that'll all go away and everything will be fine. Well, that was only one slice of the inequity. As we started handing out the licenses, or letting people qualify for the licenses, some of what was on the application was about their criminal history. And so a population that has been overly criminalized for it then was starting further back in that race to get those licenses. And so, even today, we only have 4% of the retail licenses that are held by African Americans. And so we have a lot of work to do to try to get that issue addressed. We've had a social equity in cannabis task force that has come up with recommendations that are filtering through.
And LCB has just launched its social equity
Yes.
license program.
Yes, indeed.
But the criticism that we do hear, the Seattle Times just did a big story about this, is that a decade later, that some are saying that the new efforts for inclusion are just, a decade late and millions of dollars short, essentially. Is it too late to address this issue, to rectify? Because as you know, New York just launched recreational sales. They're leading with social equity.
Yeah.
States have learned from this and are trying to engineer it differently. But what do you think?
Right. I think 10 years ago when the initiative was passed, a lot of people thought Washington was going to be at the leading edge of this. And what we've seen is as other states open up, they take the lessons from Washington and say we're gonna do it differently. So, to a large degree, I think Washington's lost its competitive advantage that it could have had then. But it was new, and a lot of the regulation was based off of the alcohol system, and let's apply those same principles here. I think about my business and in long-term care, and so many people think, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to get in on that. But looking back, 19 years and regulation, I think I don't know if I would wish this on anybody with the conundrum that it's in. It's not just that easy. And when you could decide to give additional licenses out tomorrow, any way you want to do it, those businesses are then at a disadvantage. And I think we have some restrictions built into Washington in terms of, cash flow and out-of-state investment that make it even more difficult for those businesses to succeed when they are competing against somebody that has 10 years of experience on them.
Well, so that kind of leads then to a question about what you think you can accomplish this year in this committee on this question, especially in light of what's already being done by Liquor Cannabis Board and any other changes in the law. Is this more of a wait and see if changes that have already been made start to work, or is there something really specific from a policy standpoint that you are advocating for here in 2023?
I think one of the strong messages we've heard is that people are tired of waiting and seeing, and without a time machine where we can go back and fix it, we really only have what we have now and the tools that we create for ourselves. And so I think the LCB, I appreciate their commitment, but what they're doing isn't the only thing that needs to be done. The recommendations that came out of the task force, I think, still need to have some implementation. There are some ideas around, it's more than just getting the capital, although there is a bill on that would allow greater access to capital because it wouldn't be limited just inside of the state, residents who are offering that. I think we also have to make sure that the technical expertise is there. Certainly folks who are in the legacy market who got shut out have the expertise around growing the plant, but getting a license, getting loans, setting up a big operation, all of the agriculture, like all of that is technical expertise that maybe is has not been available to them, and we got to make sure that that is funded, and possibly even some low interest revolving loan program. Those kinds of things I think are important pieces, and we still need to make sure that we're pursuing that.
What is the appetite for allowing out-of-state ownership of licensed cannabis businesses?
We hear a lot from businesses who are currently underway at all three tiers, producer, processor, retailer, that it would be very helpful, and they're in support. And our folks who would qualify as social equity candidates, who again are starting further behind, they're feeling like, why would you do that, allowance that would benefit maybe everybody who's currently in business, but the folks who are still starting behind are still behind. Like, it doesn't get them ahead. So there's really a wish on their part to hold off on something that would, advantage the rest of the industry until they can get caught up. And so I think we as a committee are struggling to figure out what's the right path there.
Okay. I want to go back to something you mentioned a little while ago, which was the high THC content in some of these products.
Mm-hmm.
And what the state can and should do about this. And it seems like there's sort of competing ideas. One is you could tax the higher THC products at a different level. And some have said that's a bad idea because you'll push it to the black market. You could also come in and regulate it and say you can't produce super high THC level products, especially because of concerns about people's reaction. What are you thinking should be done about this? Because this is there's all this stuff hitting the market that some of it's hemp based,
Right.
some of it is cannabis.
Yeah, that's a whole nother.
That is a whole different
is the hemp, hemp-derived THC. Well, I mean, back to what I said in the beginning is like I want what I got and what that guy has, but don't want them having what I have. So there's more to it than just high and low. Some patients, medical patients, for pain rely on the high potency, and what we've seen with the legalization is that consumers have driven towards that and demanded more of that. And then there are some patients, for medical users that want the low potency THC. We currently have a flat tax rate. I had a proposal that was heard yesterday to tier that, based on potency amounts, but it's not exactly clear what's exactly low and what's exactly high and what that tax rate should be. So I think we need more information collected from the retailers on total amount of milligrams of THC that we could have some more data on to see if there are any brighter lines that divide the tiers that would make for a fairer tax system, but also deter some of those younger users from, I would consider it maybe top shelf or higher end cannabis. But at the same time, this is an educational process for me as well. Those producers are saying, well, if we go with lower potency, then what is it filled with? And is that going to be what people want to ingest? So,
well, Representative Kloba, there was a bill last year, the Liquor Cannabis Board request bill, I believe, didn't pass. They're quite concerned about kids getting access to these high THC level products. There's been talk of potential psychosis, events. Again, I just want to be really clear, what do you think this committee is prepared to do or not do this year, especially because this isn't the first year you've heard about this?
Right. Last year we funded research so that we could understand better, is there a specific causational relationship between high frequency use of high THC products among youth? I think there's still question about whether or not there's a predisposition that someone has that makes them at a higher risk for this condition. It is very concerning, and I know that our committee cares a lot about it. It's also not clear in the studies because, again, remember, these are youth, so they're not buying it at a retail store because they would lose their license. Mm-hmm. And so this is illicit market. It may be coming from a plant. It may be coming from hemp via a very intense chemical process that changes it from CBD into THC, and different forms of THC that are not technically illegal because we define cannabis, or we used to, around the amount of delta-9 THC, which is a particular shape of a model.
Delta-8.
Delta-8, those are a different shape. They are essentially THC. They do the same thing.
But can you just pass a law saying Delta-8 counts, and we're going to regulate it?
The problem is the products that have that have a number of unknown chemicals in them. The process by which they are created is not approved. And the other part is that we live in a marketplace where it is closed, right? You can only grow it here. You can only sell it here. Yeah. Hemp can be grown anywhere. Hemp does not require the same kind of licensing. And when you allow a THC product that consumers think of as the same thing into a closed market without any of those other regulations, you've blown up the market. And so that's not how we want to treat it 10 years in.
So what's the solution?
So the solution is to make sure that you regulate what is cannabis that came from the cannabis plant and what came from a hemp plant. Make sure that they stay separate. And we currently allow CBD grown outside of the system if it meets certain criteria and testing and quality and all of that. But definitely drawing a bright line between the two things and making sure that the LCB has the authority to go after folks who are selling these Delta 8 products online to children. They've been able to get it out of like the gas stations and things like that. Yeah, that was very problematic. And I think recognizing that the gas stations often also have a liquor license, they could put some pressure on through that.
So do you agree with this approach?
Yeah, I think that the state does need to have regulatory authority over the hemp-derived THC. But just as more context, you have a Court of Appeals opinion saying once hemp, always hemp. So because that is newer than the regulated cannabis-derived THC, I think it's going to take more time going through the courts to help shape this conversation, just across the country.
We are running out of time. I want to ask you about interstate commerce. California passed a law last year to allow for interstate sales, but they're not allowed federally, but now you're considering a similar bill. I understand this is about getting ready if and when the courts say.
Yeah, and that's where we can do some work to position Washington for federalization and what would that look like for our current producers. They currently have a tiered system and a cap on how much they can grow. I would say that if things were legalized federally, we would have to lift that for all the producers in Washington so that they could, because they're going to have to compete on a much different scale and be able to grow as much and create as much product as possible without a limit to how much canopy they can have. Do you have the sense that this is right around the corner? Are we on the cusp of something? Or?
No, I think when the drafter of the bill came up with it, there was some really good progress being made at the federal level. And I think with all the changes that have been made in the composition of that body recently, most money is on the fact that it's not imminent. And so that does, add more uncertainty to the businesses who are in there, but it also means that we have some opportunity to take a deep breath and figure out exactly what are the things that we'll want to have in place so that our businesses can compete on the national market.
Okay. We are out of time. I want to give you each a chance to sort of close out here. Just a few final thoughts, because this is, especially around cannabis and where we are today, there's a lot going on. But what would be your main message when you talk to constituents on this? What's your takeaway?
I think constituents need more education. I think clearly, the voters voted for this and have an expectation that it's something that they want to do. And I think we still want a safe, regulated market. We see a lot going on with public safety and cannabis shops being targeted. So prioritizing, protecting them, and we've done some things this year with assessing the security threats with those stores. So I think we need more education for students. We can do that in the K-12 system. I think we need safety for those licensees that are out there, and just basic business principles of cash flow, and will help them, the existing ones and the ones to come, to be able to thrive.
Obviously, cannabis banking, a big issue. It's also a federal issue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and it's been my pleasure to chair this committee for the last 2 years, and then this year we do a co-leadership model with Representative Wiley, and so that's been very interesting. And I think, my main approach is that these are all substances or activities that have existed, for millennia. They're not going to go away. We've tried prohibition in a variety of shapes and sizes on them, and that brings sometimes more problems that are even worse than what we started out with. So, the vast majority of adults will be able to utilize these products or participate in the activities, but we, because we derive revenue from it, from all of them like we do, it's really incumbent on us to make sure that we are mitigating any of the harms, and all of them do come with harms. And so if we can try to focus on that and make sure that we're listening to the treatment and prevention community and getting their perspective, as well as the business perspective, it's really a 360-degree look that we have to be taking all the time.
Okay. Representative Shelley Kloba, the co-chair of the Regulated Substances and Gaming Committee in the House, and Representative Kelly Chambers, thank you both for being here, the ranking Republican on that committee. Thank you both so much. Appreciate it.